we're comparing your brain with itself. And we talked a little bit about those measurements. We measure the left and the right hemisphere activity. We measure harmony, which is basically brainwave frequency distribution in the brain. So they're not consciously trying to regulate or control anything. The brain is actually making all the decisions and deciding what changes to make and when. With Cereset, it just takes the conscious mind out of it.
Going back to how the brain functions from past experiences, emotions, and how that's regulated through like different chemical processes in the brain, which makes sense on how it has to be so individualized on a session by session basis.
I've always used Caraset as a way to explain to patients who have used heavy medication or chemicals, because you have, of course, the brain chemistry chemical wise, but then you also have electricity, which I think a lot of people forget that part of the brain.
Right.
It's that part of client improvement. So I have a lot of patients who come to me and they're saying, look, I've tried this, I've tried this, I've tried this, I've tried this. And I'm like, okay, chemical, you are missing electrical. This is why Caraset, and it just clicked for them.
Welcome to the Functional Code, your go-to source for decoding optimal health. Join Dr. Addy and Dr. Jace as they break down the science behind pain, performance, longevity, and more, making complex concepts easy for you to understand and apply in your life. Your journey to a healthier you begins with understanding the Functional Code.
Welcome back to the Functional Code. Today we have a very special podcast. This is something that we're very excited to bring to you. We have a guest, Sonya Crittenden. Hopefully I said that. With her, she's bringing a lot of knowledge of certain technology that can help from everything from enhancing mood, helping with sleep, stress, energy, cognitive abilities, whether it's kids all the way up to elderly adults. So super, super excited to dive into this one today. And thank you, Sonya, for making us coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And as always, I'm Dr. Jace.
And I'm Dr. Addy. And today I'm super excited to have Sonya here today. I myself worked for a Cereset franchise in Minnesota, and I was able to experience some of the more remarkable effects that it's had on the clients that we had. I know Sonya has probably 20 times the amount of experience being with Cereset for so long. I was only there for a year, but with that year, by and large, one of my favorite companies I've ever worked for, and just the effects that we saw. I continually have referred patients from back home to Cereset in Minnesota, and then also now I'm down in Arizona. I've been continuing to tell people about it. So thank you again, Sonya, for being here. I'm excited to dive into all of this with you. Really, to get started, I think we wanted to just start this story out with you. We know that there was maybe a journey into Cereset before you got there. So really, have you always been in healthcare? And really, where did this journey start before you obviously came to work with Cereset?
So this is actually a totally kind of bizarre story, to be honest, because if I had found out 20 years ago, if someone had said this is where you'd be, I'd be completely shocked. This was not my life plan at all. So before Cereset, I was in the medical field, but like the traditional medical field. Growing up, my dad was a psychiatrist. Okay. And so mental health and all that, those were all normal topics in our home. And I very much wanted to follow in his path. So I was working as a medical assistant at an urgent care facility. I loved it, loved working with patients and the patient care aspect. And actually, like my long-term goal was to go to PA school and become a physician's assistant. And I had my heart set on that. That was my path. That was what I was going to be doing. So my father passed away when I was in my early 20s from cancer. So many years later, my sister and I were harassing my mom to do like online dating or something to try to meet someone, meet some friends, and just be a little more social. So she calls me one day and I had a coffee date, which totally surprised me because I was like, oh my gosh, she actually did it. And I was like, how did it go? And there wasn't any chemistry, but this man is a genius. He is doing the most insane things with the brain. And this is so up your alley and you need to look him up. His name is Lee Gertis.
Oh my gosh. I did not know that.
Yeah. And I was like, okay. And she was telling me, he's working with the brain. His view is the brain is the master controller of the entire system. If you can optimize the brain, you're going to optimize the system. And I was like, that makes sense to me. Why are we not doing that? I went online and Googled the company and what he was doing. And there was a lot of research backing up what he was doing. So it wasn't like woo snake oil. So I was like, this is really cool. So at the same time, I also learned that they were hiring for a tech. So I was like, let's just see what happens. And I got hired and started working for the company. And even at the time when I took the position, I was like, I'll do this for a year or two and then move on to PA school. And I just fell in love with what I was doing. And the technology just clicked to me. I got it. Brain data fascinated me. It's like putting a puzzle together. And brain activity, brainwave activity, it's the brain's language. It's how the brain is communicating with itself in the body. So if you can learn what the brain is saying, that's fascinating.
Sure.
So that really appealed to me. And 12 years later, I'm still there.
You might have to help me with the history, but it wasn't always called Caraset prior, right?
Correct.
Were you with Caraset prior to the name change?
Yes.
Okay.
So when I joined the company in 2012, it was Brain State Technologies, and the technology was called brainwave optimization.
Okay.
And so that was the legacy version, which was still based on the same foundational principles. We are echoing the brain's activity using musical tones or musical frequencies. But the echoes were not real-time adjusting. So we weren't using machine learning at that time. So they were just stationary echoes, which required the tech coach to analyze the client's data and then select manual echoes. And so the exercise was that entire echo. It was never changing or adjusting. So with Caraset, that's when the machine learning came in and we were able to integrate that into the software, where then the software was able to read how the brain was responding and changing in real time and then adjust the echo as the brain was adjusting. And so that
Adaptable.
Exactly. And that increased the speed that the brain was able to change dramatically. And so with that change, there was a lot of changes with how we applied the technology. So with brainwave optimization, it was 10 sessions twice a day. Each session was 100 minutes. So that was, as a client, that was your entire day. You would come in the morning, pretty much be in the chair for 2 hours. We'd give you a lunch break, and then you'd come back in the afternoon and do it again. So when Caraset evolved, we were able to dramatically shorten the sessions. Instead of 10 sessions, it was 5 sessions. Instead of twice a day, it was once a day. Yeah. So it definitely made it more accessible to more people. So rather than having to take a whole week off of work and completely focus and dedicate all your time to this, you're able to just pop in the morning and then maybe go back to work or school.
Which is obviously a lot easier on people who, instead of taking how much time off of work to do these kinds of sessions, now you drastically reduce that. Right. And I know that was always nice for patients, because I don't know if it's still this way, but was it the 4 sessions, wait a month, last final session? Is that still how it goes?
It's adjusted a little bit because we've had another technology advancement, which every time we advance the technology, it advances the speed. And we have to be very conscientious that we are not pushing the brain too fast, especially, based on a client's background and history, what they have going on. If they are more compromised physically, what have you, their brain is going to only have so much capacity to move so fast and make adjustments. So we have to move at the pace of the brain. At this point in time, there's a lot more difference in between how often sessions are scheduled based on the client's background and history. So some clients are doing sessions every other day. Some clients may have them as often as once a week if they have a more compromised background or history. It really depends.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I know with clients who have gone through the process, they will still continue to want to get on sessions, and it might depend on if they want to continue that monthly or even monthly.
Yeah.
Again, it's a lot of variability.
I was actually curious on this too. So for me, not having the experience with this technology, I'm going to look at it from a layman's terms person coming in. So I would love for you to just explain just briefly a little bit more in depth on what the technology is, and what are certain things or certain aspects that people may have on why and how they could utilize this technology for them, if I may.
So basically, Caraset is an advanced brain technology that helps the brain to release and recover from stress. And that's really the entire focus. And if we look at stress at this point in time, research has unequivocally determined that stress has profound negative impacts on the brain's function, on its performance, on its structure. And because the brain is the master controller of the entire system, it's regulating your physiological processes, your emotional responses, your behavioral responses, your cognitive abilities. Stress can negatively impact all of those areas. So our focus with Caraset is if we are able to help the brain release stress, recover, the brain's performance is naturally enhanced. And all of those areas can be improved. You can see improved thinking ability, improved mood and emotional well-being, improved energy, sleep. So that's really the focus. We're not focusing on specific diagnoses or even symptoms. It's helping the brain release, recover from stress because it's become such an obstacle to achieving wellness for most people. And I think stress has become such a hot topic word over the last 10 years, which is great because it's more of the conversation. But at the same time, I think that's also made stress lose a bit of its impact and meaning for people. And we forget that medical textbooks ascribe anywhere from 50 to 90% of all diseases and disorders as having stress-related origins. 75 to 90% of all doctor's office visits are for stress-related complaints. 72% of people will experience stress that impacts their mental health. When we talk about disorder and dysfunction, unfortunately, rarely the conversation goes back to what role is stress having. And that's what we're trying to do is bring the focus back to stress and helping the brain release and recover from that.
So it's we mentioned Lee a little bit prior here. I'm not an expert on his background, but I do know he has an engineering background, not medical. But his vision, I think with this, if you want to just jump into a little bit of why he chose to create this technology and then some of the, maybe the influences that he had to push Cereset the way that it was, and then why did he continue to drive this path of building Cereset?
So Lee's story was so interesting as well. And really, he created Caraset out of necessity. He was assaulted by 3 youths with a baseball bat when he was actually acting as a pastor in San Francisco at the time. And he suffered a traumatic brain injury and as a result, experienced all sorts of issues, insomnia, emotional issues, cognitive issues. And so he began this 8-year journey of trying to fix himself. And he tried all sorts of different things, neurofeedback and counseling and therapy. And he saw little bits of improvement here and there, but it was nothing that he was looking as far as getting back to where he wasn't able to do that. And so he did have an engineering background. And he started to think, well, what would happen if I just looked at my own brain? So he got just some rudimentary EEG materials and started measuring his own brain activity and started making these correlations of, hey, when my brain is asymmetrical, when my left hemisphere is not firing with my right hemisphere, I'm angry, I'm upset, I'm stressed, I'm anxious, and started to make all these correlations. And so then, of course, the next question was, what happens if I'm able to synchronize those hemispheres again? And that's where the development of Cereset came into play. And actually, Cereset is actually rooted in quantum physics. So there is a law in quantum physics, the law of observation or the observation effect, where basically it states if you observe a quantum system, just that act of observing changes that system. So Lee took it a step further and developed a technology that enabled the brain to observe itself. And just that act of observing itself, because the brain has its own awareness, the brain is able to change itself.
Yeah. And so I think that's a great segue into what does that observation look like and how is it able to do that? And why is the brain being able to observe itself want to make changes when it can actually understand what it's doing in real time?
Right. So with Cereset, we use musical tones for the brain to observe itself. So basically, we use specialized EEG sensors, which are placed on the client's scalp. And those measure the brain's electrical activity or brainwave activity. And like we talked about, that's just the brain's language, how the brain is communicating with itself and the body. And our software converts those brain activities into corresponding musical frequencies. So that is just like translating language. Go from English to French or French to English, same thing. We're taking electrical activity, changing it to musical frequency. And that happens really fast in real time. And that's played to the client in real time while they're just relaxing. Most of our clients even sleep through their sessions. And the brain very quickly picks up on, hey, this is me. And once it's able to recognize itself in the echo, it uses that information to begin making changes because it can see where there are imbalances between the left and the right hemisphere, or where there's areas in the brain that may be overactivated or underactivated, and the brain can then self-adjust.
It's not the typical musical tones that you may think of. Is it almost like a static-ish frequency, or how would you best describe what that sounds like?
They're highly engineered.
Yeah.
So it's not like someone's in the background with the keyboard just plucking away. And it doesn't sound like typical music.
Right.
So if you were to, if we were to like hook him up and have you listen to his brain echo, you'd be like, this just sounds like noise. This is not relaxing. And because it's very randomized. It's not a song, it's not a melody, it's not a chorus. They're just random tones. But when it's your own brain that you're listening to, because there's that echo and that resonance happening, it's very soothing and relaxing. But if you're to listen to someone else's echo, that resonance isn't happening. So you don't have that same effect. And it's not as enjoyable or relaxing.
Fascinating. And I asked this question to Doc a couple days ago, and I said, okay, so if there's this brain activity that the brain wants to observe, to have it recognize and almost heal itself to a certain extent, that if another person listening, like you were saying, that's not as pleasant, would that then affect another person's brain activity more negatively? Is that more or less?
No. If you were to listen to someone else's brain echo, again, because that resonance isn't happening, the brain would just dismiss that as noise.
Sure.
Just like you were listening to music or a toddler playing on a piano, it would just be like, oh, that's noise.
Yeah.
So there's no meaning in that. So it has to be your echo at that exact moment in time. So we can't even record a client's echo and play it for them an hour later and have there be a positive effect, because the brain has changed and that there's no longer that resonance. So it has to be in that moment. And every session is completely unique to that individual. So no two sessions are ever the same. Every session is entirely unique to the individual.
That is incredible.
Maybe for some of you listening, it sounds similar to neurofeedback, but it is not neurofeedback. So do you want to just maybe explain the difference between the two?
Yeah, so there's a couple of differences. So neurofeedback, of course, is based on classic conditioning, which essentially says you can condition a specific response using repetition and some sort of reward or positive reinforcement, sometimes even negative reinforcement. So with neurofeedback, essentially the patient or the client is learning how to consciously change and regulate their own brain, and then they're receiving positive or negative reinforcement based on what their brain is doing. So if their brain is doing a positive thing, they get that positive reinforcement. So if you do that over and over again, the idea is they can learn to train and regulate their own brain. So with Caraset, we take the conscious brain out of it, because with neurofeedback, that does require the client or the patient to use their own focus, attention, willpower to make these things happen. And especially for people that are struggling with attention and focus issues, anxiety issues. I've worked with so many clients that have come to us and said, oh, I did neurofeedback, but I have performance anxiety. So the sessions were really stressful because I'm like, I'm paying a lot of money to be here and I need to get results. And then that would just heighten their anxiety the more the session went on. So with Caraset, it just takes the conscious mind out of it. Like I said, most of our clients just sleep through their sessions. So they're not consciously trying to regulate or control anything. The brain is actually making all the decisions and deciding what changes to make and when. The other difference with neurofeedback is that essentially they use an ideal brain model to compare the brain against. And that's developed basically by averaging a lot of brain data together, right? And then you come up with, this isn't a typical brain or an average brain or an ideal brain.
Yeah.
At Caraset, we strongly believe every brain is unique, which is a fact.
Totally.
No two brains on the planet are the same or similar. You can even have similar diagnosis as someone else or similar symptoms, and your brains will be different. They will not be the same. Most people assume like we'll have the same patterns. Not the case. every brain expresses itself differently. So we don't believe that we should be making brains all try to look the same. A 40-year-old female artist is not going to thrive with the male of a 20-year-old male athlete, right? They have different needs, goals, strengths, and that should be reflected in how you work with their brain. And so with Cereset, we do not use an ideal or an average brain model, and we're only comparing the brain with itself. So we're not comparing your brain to someone else's. We're comparing your brain with itself. And we talked a little bit about those measurements. We measure the left and the right hemispheres activity. We measure harmony, which is basically brainwave frequency distribution in the brain. And that's how we assess your brain. So we're never comparing it to someone else's.
And I think Caraset's effectiveness is because it's so custom personalized
Correct.
to the,
Yes.
the client,
Yes,
which
absolutely.
I think standard neurofeedback or even other types of neuro treatments is very protocol standard based.
Right.
And so you don't get the tailoring of someone else's true state of brain at that point in time.
Right.
Which, even for those doing neurofeedback, I know because I've been in clinics that have done it, there even isn't a baseline. It's just, I know that this protocol can be helpful for those who have ADHD, so we'll just put you on it. And they don't even do baseline EEGs. And again, that's just not going to give you the outcome that I think you're looking for.
That was one of the things that actually surprised me when I started working for Brain State Cereset was, again, you have a lot of assumptions of if someone has this symptom, they're all going to share the same patterns, right? The same brain activity or the same patterns. And while there are definite correlations with anxiety, there's 20 different expressions of that or more in the brainwave activity. Migraines, so many different expressions of that in the brain or brain activity. So if you have one protocol based on a symptom or a diagnosis, chances are you're not going to be effective for all of those people.
Yeah.
It makes so much sense. Even going back to how the brain functions from past experiences, emotions, and how that's regulated through like different chemical processes in the brain, which makes sense on how it has to be so individualized on a session by session basis, if we will. So I know in the past, you guys do certain scans. Are the clients able to see the scans from when they first come in and a progression thereof?
So during the first session, we do a baseline reading, which is just a raw data read, and then we're able to produce reports for the client so they can see what their brain is doing and where they're starting. And we can make some correlations to them as far as what they may be experiencing, what these patterns mean, how it's impacting their performance, their ability. And then at the end of the sessions, they get follow-up reports so they can visually see how their brain is changing.
Which I think is great data for people to see anyway. Because a lot of people rely so heavily on improvement with objective data. It's easy to say, you're doing fine, you're doing better. But it's really powerful. People really do so much better when they can objectively see change too.
Yeah. I think even the baselines at the beginning are so helpful because they're validating for people. Especially because we have so many clients that come to us and they've been suffering for decades, years with what's going on. And they've oftentimes gone through a long journey of trying to figure out what is going on and why am I experiencing these things. And they've had so many hopes and failures during that period of time. And so when they're able to see it in their brain activity, it's like validating, oh my gosh, this isn't just like in my head. And this is a real thing and there is hope.
I would even explain it as, in certain cases, I've always used Caraset as a way to explain to patients who have used heavy medication or chemicals, because you have, of course, the brain chemistry, chemical-wise, but then you also have electricity, which I think a lot of people forget that part of the brain. Right. It's that part of client improvement. So I have a lot of patients who come to me and they're saying, look, I've tried this, I've tried this, I've tried this, I've tried this. And I'm like, okay, chemical, you are missing electrical. This is why Cereset, and it just clicked for them. And then of course they would go in, of course their electrical mapping showed such a disarray, and then of course they'd do it and they finally saw that the benefits that they were looking for. Yeah. And for those of you listening, I think that's something to think about, which is, I tried the melatonin, I did sleep pills, all the other things, right? Have you tried any type of electrical? Because then that's probably what you're missing.
That's a common question we get as far as, because those are electrochemical signals, how does Cereset impact the chemical piece? And our hypothesis is that the electrical signals drive the chemical signals, like a train. The chemical is the cargo, basically, and the electrical signals are driving. So that's our theory on that.
Yeah. No, I love that.
That's good.
Doctor, any questions?
I am learning so much. No, this is awesome. I originally looked at coming in some of the past videos, the testimonials. This is actually a real thing that most people are not aware of. In fact, I'm surprised that more people have not heard of some of this technology before, which is fascinating to me. Are you guys looking to do more education in terms of either in correlation with universities or any other research that you guys are wanting to do personalized moving forward?
Yeah. So I know we're often referred to as like the best kept secret. And to be honest, the reason why you don't hear about Caraset very often is because we are a very small company. Caraset headquarters is 12 employees. So we're very small, but focus is growth over the next few years. And we do have a research relationship with Wake Forest School of Medicine, and that's ongoing, and that's a continual effort. And we'll hopefully be having some results we can publish later on this year. Yeah.
Extensive already from what we found on your website. 80 plus abstracts, presentations. You have 16 peer-reviewed publications, 9 IRB-approved clinical trials, which is not easy to do.
Yeah.
And then thousands of, obviously, participants in these trials. By and large, when we look at any treatment or any improvement in patients, that's the first thing that we look at. And so it already can give you just maybe some peace of mind before starting Cereset, because you've already done the due diligence to really show. And I've looked into a lot of them, obviously, when I was with Cereset, showing how many military personnel they've worked with, veterans. This is PTSD, and maybe you can even touch on that too. Where do you find a subset of conditions that you feel Cereset can improve? I'm sure there's many,
right?
But even just the general, for those listening out there, where do you find Cereset does shine in improving certain conditions, or clients listening?
So the main 5 areas that we pretty much talk about as far as benefits for Cereset are cognitive abilities. So that's thinking, attention and focus, memory, stress regulation. So ability to cope and regulate stress, emotional well-being, sleep, and energy. So those are really the 5 main areas. And of course, you can correlate those to all sorts of post-traumatic stress disorder, people struggling with mental health issues. So it can be applied in so many different ways. And even though it's not focusing on this specific disorder, again, you're helping the brain release the stress that may be triggering or aggravating those issues. And even with some of the trials, like the PTSD trial, even though it's post-traumatic stress disorder, if you dive into the data, they did insomnia indexes, they did perceived stress indexes, general anxiety indexes. So all of those different factors were also assessed during those trials.
A lot of those patients at the time, obviously, they're going to have a plethora of symptoms.
Correct. It's that constellation.
Which is why I think Cereset does such a great job, is because it doesn't just hone in on maybe the one thing that is the problem. Usually when you have cognitive change, there's many parts of the lobes that are affected.
Mm-hmm.
And
absolutely.
I think that's maybe just something that a lot of people, we always find that people hone in on always one thing. They forget that the body has so many other things going on.
Mm-hmm.
So
mm-hmm.
when you can work more holistically in that sense,
yeah.
obviously you're going to see change. But I actually am interested if you could just touch more on that too. So the lobes of the brain should have similar frequencies to their counterparts. When they don't have that, what does that usually do to the state of the health of the brain? And what do you usually find when patients are not symmetrical?
One of the biggest things that we see is they can tell us how the brain is coping with stress. And it depends, of course, of the lobe of the brain that you're looking at, because there's different correlations based on what that part of the brain does and regulates and processes. But when we look at the temporal lobes, which is a really important area of the brain that we focus on, that right and left hemispheric activity tells us how the brain is coping with stress. So when the right temporal lobe is overactivated, it tells us that brain is in a fight or flight stress response, which is an overactivated stress state where the brain is mobilizing energy to give you resources to fight or flee. And then when the left temporal lobe is overactivated, it tells us the brain is activated in a freeze state or parasympathetic stress state. And that's a low arousal stress state where the brain is trying to conserve energy by slowing down. So that can give us a lot of information on basically how the whole brain, because it's almost like the temporal lobes are like the operating system of your brain. So if your operating system is overactivated, everything else is going to be overactivated. If your operating system is shut down and conserving energy, your whole brain is going to be shutting down and conserving energy. So it can give us a lot of information about how the whole brain is really functioning.
And there are different symptom correlations with
Absolutely.
the more right temporal lobe firing versus
Yeah.
left.
Yes.
And I know with obviously fight or flight comes maybe more hyperactivity, feeling worriness, stress, high running blood, those kinds of things versus free state. I think most people have understood what that feels like through COVID and just being exhausted. And and correct me if I'm wrong, but we usually, when we find a client in a free state, they have been in a fight or flight for so long. Now we are basically, like you said, shutting down and just trying to get whatever energy we have left because we've been stressed for so long. Is that kind of what?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's not unusual because, like you said, to get to a free state, the brain was likely in fight or flight for a long period of time before. So they often very much resonate with kind of the overactivation, hyperactivity, racing thoughts, anxiety, and the fatigue, the low emotional response, the tendency to want to internalize or self-isolate. They resonate with both because they recognize both. Yeah.
Burnout.
Exactly.
Probably more free state. You're done.
You're shutting down
Right.
your system. Wake me up when this is over. Yeah.
Incredible. Is there other things that you guys look at outside of the temporal lobes? I'm assuming obviously, but between the occipital frontal lobe, or is that more the difference between the left and right side of the brain, or how do those sides play into?
So in addition to the left and right brainwave activity, we also look at, we call it harmony, which is basically how the brain is distributing brainwave activity. And brainwave activity is just the brain's language. And different activity encodes different information. So high frequencies tend to encode more conscious activity. Low frequencies tend to encode more subconscious, kind of behind the scenes processing. So based on the area of the brain and what it's responsible for, you're going to want to see a certain distribution of those frequencies for optimal functioning. For example, the back of the brain, occipital lobe, parietal lobe, those are sensory areas of the brain. They are responsible for processing all of your sensory information, making meaning of that. The back of the brain is going to do better with more low frequency information. The front of the brain, which is more of the executive function of the brain and decision making, problem solving, execution, the front of the brain is going to do better with more high frequency distribution at the front. So we want to see that the kind of low to front, back to front distribution.
And that's cool because it makes so much sense, obviously, with frontal,
Yeah.
super executive. Yeah, exactly, for sure. You touched on when the session is ongoing, clients will hear music.
Yes.
And was there a reason why you guys found that music was the all driving force to create change, I guess, in the brain? And how did that get started to utilize music?
So Lee decided to use music because the brain moves so fast. Music was the closest thing that could be processed fast enough where the brain could start making those connections and resonances. Yes. So we had to use something that the brain could process that information almost as fast as it was moving. And sound was the way to do that.
And I always found it interesting when the music was being fed in and just how quickly you can start seeing certain changes in frequency the second the brain was able to almost see itself or hear itself, as you say. And I think that's about as quick as I've ever studied or seen the brain being able to be influenced in real time. I have yet to find anything that can influence it that quickly without an external stimulus being put in.
Correct.
And that's the most fascinating part for me, because again, with neurofeedback, if you've never had neurofeedback, there's usually bright lights being flashed. It's just constant audio either being taken away from you or being elevated. It sometimes is even troublesome for those who already have sensory issues from either a TBI. So the fact that it's either just sustained music and you really don't have to do much other than just sit relaxed in the chair. I always slept during my sessions because it was very peaceful.
Yeah.
And always I always was excited for my sessions because I just knew how much it helped. But yeah, I know you can even choose the different types of music if you prefer to hear string versus piano and things like that too.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Fascinating. And I know even with music too, it can release like an emotional state, whether it's you've experienced in the past. This is outside of the Cereset's type of music coming in, but that would make sense on the regulation and how it can reach other brain centers and then have some sort of a neuroplastic change on making it much easier and quicker. Have you noticed with some clients that have utilized this technology that there's almost like a deja vu or similar type of emotion feel when going through each session, or is it very person to person?
It really varies person to person and their experience with the session. Some people just fall asleep instantly and it's like you wake them up and it's over. It's already done. And then some people might have an emotional experience where they feel like emotions like rising to the surface that they've locked down for a long time. Other people we've had people have the aha moment. Oh my gosh, I figured out my problem. So it really depends on the person and even where they're at that particular point in time.
And I want to highlight, I think we jumped over a little bit here, but the one thing that I also wanted to bring up was just Cereset's system to helping you during this process too. And I know we touched a little bit about the utilization of what are called brain techs in your company, but I really found, and we were even told this too when we were utilizing this system, but the questions that you guys ask and just how to even set up your mindset coming into Cereset was beautiful. And we even would use some of the questions that you guys would ask clients because we loved how it invoked a certain emotional state or even getting some understanding of what to expect coming into Cereset. And I know one of my favorite questions was, if you were to reach, I guess, 100% after utilizing Cereset, what does that look like for you? Because some people come in expecting to just, I don't know, they're in such a chronic state of, I guess, disarray, and they're not even sure what to expect.
Right.
But then you give them this guided system of questions and walking them through this process, and at least they now understand what to shoot for on the other side of this.
Right.
Because too many times I think we bring it, in our case, we bring patients in and they have a lot of stuff going on and they're like, look, I just want to feel like I'm 20 years old again. And I'm like, what do you expect? I can't take an 80-year-old and turn you into a 20-year-old. So at least getting your mindset forward on something that we can agree upon to get to at some point. I really appreciated Cereset's walking through and the systemic questioning, and I know clients really enjoyed that.
Yeah, that's an important part, especially because a lot of clients coming into this process, they may be very disconnected from even what they are experiencing to some degree because, if you're in a free state, you will be a little bit disconnected anyways. So it's important to really have them delve into what is really happening here and what are you really experiencing and what does success look like realistically? What is something tangible we can aim for so that we know when we got there, oh, we've hit the benchmark. So we really want to have those defined before we jump into the process.
And that's it's a pretty decent part of the process too. Some of those conversation questionings can be anywhere from 10 to even 30 minutes of just talking.
Right.
Which can help. Again, so many people need to just talk more about their issues as well. Too many people just usually shut down, men especially.
Right.
But that can be such a crucial point of the session as well.
Yeah.
So with some of those questions, is it different questions depending on what the symptoms are or what the client comes in with? And do you change the questions that you ask based on that?
So there's a foundational set of questions that every client is going to be asked. And then the tech coach may add some additional questions based on their responses and based on what's happening. But there is a core base of questions that every client will be asked. Yeah.
So I guess the last thing that I want to get into, which I think is going to be fun to talk about, is just the experiences, testimonials, cases that maybe we can touch on a little bit. I know you have many more than I do, but are there any maybe recently that you've just are willing to share regarding a certain case and just maybe want to touch a little bit on that?
Yeah, I have a couple clients that I've been working with for probably 8 years now. And I always call them my best students because they're so committed to this process, but they're committed because they've seen the benefits. And one was, she was, I believe, 18 or 17 when I started working with her. And her dad brought her in and was like, I just don't know what to do. She had extreme fatigue. I mean, would sleep 12 to 13 hours a day and still be tired. Couldn't function in school, didn't have a social life, just didn't have the energy for any of that. And dad had taken her to every doctor. Nobody knows what to do. Nothing is helping her. She's missing out on her life. And so we started sessions, and it wasn't an instant, she's better. But a couple months later, the energy started to come back. And this year or last year, as she got married, she graduated college, she started her own business. Her favorite hobby is like long distance hiking and running.
Yeah.
So she will go and run for 12 hours, like up a mountain. That's her hobby. And this is a girl that couldn't get out of bed for when I first started working with her. And it's so cool to just see that whole life evolution, where her dad was so worried about her at the beginning, just because, again, she's missing out on her life.
For sure.
She's, she can't even engage in these things that she should be able to enjoy and participate in. And now she has such a full, abundant, successful life. It's just so exciting and cool to see.
And that client had a fork at one point as far as choosing a path. And we know what that modern medical route would have looked like compared to maybe coming into Cereset. Yeah. And I would argue that modern medical route was full of maybe medications. Yeah. It might have made little to no impact in her life. And now she's on, as a young woman, multiple medications. She's going even now maybe having worsening side effects from the medications, and then this spiral.
Right.
And the fact that she was able to take this pathway and see such great change without medication. Right. It's just what we preach every single day. Mm-hmm. And so that's awesome. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. It's interesting because I had a young lady as well who was a 4.0 student. She was a senior volleyball, a standout, excellent, and had multiple concussions in a short period of time. Yeah. And her grades slipped within a month of that. She couldn't stare at a sheet of homework for more than 20 minutes without getting a headache and had to sleep. She wasn't able to play sports. She really started to lose her life in a matter of months. Yeah. And this was scary. 18-year-old.
It can unravel so fast.
Scary.
Yeah.
And we started with sessions, and she actually was able to feel confident again. When you think about it, as someone who was on the ball and you feel confident and you are sharp and you're getting things done and you have a routine, and then all of that just goes haywire, if you can imagine that. Mm-hmm. And now you just about to finish high school, going into college, you need to be sharp, you need to be on the ball, especially if you're going to be playing college sports, what have you, and you just lost all of that. The fact that she was able to regain that, she, I believe, got to play sports by the end of the year. We had got her back onto that. Again, another person's life. With, again, that spiral, with what we've talked about as far as concussion goes, post-concussive symptoms can continue to spiral for the rest of your life if you don't get the proper change early on. It's really scary.
Yeah, with concussions, it's such a scary place to be because, like you said, it's not just after the concussion, it can still get worse. That's not as bad as it gets. Like, it can just continue to decline. And yeah, it can be a really scary path.
The only other one that I had was I guess I had two, but the one that really stood out was I had been seeing this patient at a clinic prior to me working at Cereset. And when I started working there, I was just telling everyone about it. And then she had heard through the grapevine about Cereset. And so when I got to see her, I was like, yeah, this is great for you. I know that you've been struggling. She slept 2 hours a night since she was in her 20s, and she's in her 40s. That was just her standard. Chronic insomnia, about as bad a case of insomnia as I've ever seen. Wow, that's dangerous, yeah. Yes, and we didn't have much expectations because we knew the severity of the case. So we said, hey, this is, again, we brought him up to speed on mindset. It's, hey, what are our expectations? What are you looking to get out of this? Here's what we're going to shoot for. She's like, if I could get 4 hours, that's a win. Anything more than 2 hours a night. And the first session, she said she went home and got the best night of sleep she's had in 20 years. Now, I have nothing to really sit here and stand on when it comes to every client who goes to Cereset might not get that outcome right away. But for her, what it did, I was astounded. I really didn't have many expectations because I just didn't know what was it, but she did. She got the best night of sleep she's had in 20 some years. And she was able to at least continue that for a long period of time. I think she wasn't able to continue with sessions, but had she not, I bet she would have still got the results that she wanted. But nothing had touched that in 20 years. Nothing. And that's what excited me about Cereset. It really, I started telling everyone about it. It was amazing.
So, question that just piqued from my mind: what's the youngest client that that you know of had to work with or got the opportunity to work with? Because I know from kids at an early age, there's a lot of like developmental processes and neuroplasticity that can affect the rest of their life. I guess what testimonials have you seen with that?
So with kids, we don't set an age range as far as we work with ages from X to Y, mainly because it mainly depends on their ability to be able to sit still for at least 20 to 30 minutes and be able to leave the sensors alone and not touch the equipment. Some 4-year-olds can do that and some 10-year-olds can't. So it really depends on the child and kind of where they're at and if they'll be able to tolerate the session, basically. So the youngest I've ever worked with was probably 4. That was very challenging because they want to put everything in their mouth. But we did make some gradual progress. I can't think of a specific kid case at this point in time.
I know we had some ADHD, just wanting more clarity, wanting more focus. We had done that. I know autism, we had just trying to, again, stay on point without having to maybe wander off and just continuing with like mental clarity and focus. I remember we had a young boy who had a head injury and they, again, so quickly impacted the boy's life. So they were wondering if there was anything that we could do. And I think we did. With kids too, though, they're changing so rapidly. And so I always found that they actually were great clients. They changed so quickly and probably had higher potential for change because of how rapidly their brain was changing. For those listening who have kids interested in this, I absolutely recommend it because you might get a better outcome than maybe a brain that's been affected over time, maybe elderly. It just doesn't have the type of neuroplasticity that a young child does.
For sure. Kids definitely have a lot more neuroplasticity than us adults do. And, they haven't had the life experiences that we've had. So the brain hasn't had time to make all these crazy patterns. And so their brains do change a lot faster. And it's usually a lot quicker with kids than adults.
Okay, so then let's look at the complete opposite side for like adults, let's say 70, 80 plus. I guess, have you had a lot of experience working with them? And what are typical like symptoms or presentations that they bring in?
Yeah. So my oldest client is currently 91. And usually with the older population, a lot of their goals are cognitive related. So memory, attention, focus. They just want to improve their cognitive capacity. And so that's an area we've seen a lot of improvement in. Yeah, just helping to bolster the memory and the clarity of thought and whatnot. And actually, this client that I'm talking about, a few months ago, she fell and broke her hip, which really worried me because at that age with the hip, it's not unusual to then become susceptible to an illness or something, and it can just decline so rapidly from there. She recovered in 2-3 months and she walked into my office and I was like, how did you do that? And she says, I'm ready for my session. And I truly believe that because she's pretty regular with her sessions, that it really set up her system to be able to heal faster.
That's awesome. And so for those, at least in the Arizona area, they want to get, let's say they've heard what we've had to say, and now they like, I want to get this. Where do I go? So how does that process look? How can they set up their first session to get the Cereset experience?
Yeah, so to set up their first session, they would just call our main office and talk to our administrative staff, and they'll get your whole background and all of your important details and go over the process with you. So how to schedule, how often, and whatnot. It's a pretty easy onboarding process as far as just getting the ball rolling.
And I know with that process, they do get a scan that first day, correct?
Correct. So the very first session, we start with that baseline reading. We take your brain data and show you a couple reports of what your brain is doing and how that might be impacting your brain, how it's impacting your brain's performance and function, what you might be experiencing as far as symptoms based on those patterns, so that you can really understand where you're starting and what's possible moving forward.
And also, you're listening outside of Arizona. Good news, because
Yeah.
plenty of franchises. Do you know how many franchises off the top of your head?
62.
62. Where would be, gosh, I'm sure. Is there other states you're not in yet?
There are states we are not in yet. I cannot rattle those off
Okay,
the
no
top of
worries.
my
But
head.
most states,
But right,
good-
there
good
is,
chance that
and
that's
there
awesome.
is a location map on our website. So if you
Perfect.
go to Caraset.com, you can go to the locations tab and you can type in your zip code and it'll show you if there's centers in your area.
There's some, because I actually looked at that, and there's others that are outside the country as well. Is that right?
Yeah, we actually have a couple overseas, Switzerland and Denmark. So
What?
yeah.
So cool.
So we're gradually expanding,
Global.
going global,
That's
baby.
awesome.
That's
So
the goal. Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Sonya, so much for coming in. And I hope everyone that was listening got such great value. If you're interested, look Cereset up. I would just recommend you guys go get a session anyway, because I would say for most of you, you're going to see change. Most of you have stress. Don't deny it. I know you guys have it out there. So again, if you are interested, look them up, Caraset.com. If you want to find any locations, it's Caraset.com/centers. Thank you guys so much for watching. And then until next time, Doc,
Absolutely.
we'll see you guys later.
Thank you.
Disclaimer, the content provided in this health podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor or 911 immediately. Reliance on any information provided in this podcast is solely at your own risk. The creators and hosts of this podcast are not responsible for any actions or decisions you may take based on the information presented.
Thanks for joining us on The Functional Code. For more evidence-based health insights, subscribe, rate and review wherever you get your podcasts. Remember, your journey to a healthier you begins with understanding the functional code. Until next time, stay well, stay informed, and embrace the science of living